Hi everyone, my name is Annie Pettit and I am the Chief Research Officer at Peanut Labs, a company that specializes in DIY sample and surveys. Thanks a bunch for finding the time to join me today for our monthly webinar. You can always find a full listing of our webinars on the Peanut Labs website under the Resources menu if you want to sign up for the next one or have a peek at what we have already done. So today I'll be chatting with you for about 25 minutes about what happens when you split a long survey into two shorter surveys. So if you have any questions while I'm chatting, do feel free to write them out in the question box at the side of your screen, and I'll get to as many of those as I can at the end of the webinar. So let's begin. I'd like to start by showing you this frightening statistic. Pew Research Center is a highly respected organization. If you're not already familiar with them, I definitely recommend that you go and take a peek. Anyways, using APOR's definition, they've calculated response rates for their surveys for more than 15 years. That's the last row of numbers. Now, the scary part is that if you calculate the next few numbers, we're going to be looking at negative response rates in just a few years. Okay, so they won't be negative, but we are on a terrible trajectory that just doesn't seem to be changing or even slowing down. We might be gradually running fewer and fewer surveys in terms of response rates, but we will never be in a position where surveys just aren't an important tool in our toolbox. So we are definitely in desperate need of solutions. Now, one of the things we can easily do is look at survey lengths. So here's just a sample of data that I've taken from my own panel. We offer samples. So what you see here is surveys that are programmed and hosted by our clients. And we've got the amount of time it's taken responders to answer surveys here. So about 53% of surveys taken in the last several months took just a few minutes, and about 20% of surveys took 15 or more minutes. There's a little blip at the 60-minute mark, but that's likely not because people took hours to answer the survey. They probably just answered the survey in stages, a few minutes here or there. Now, these numbers are actually pretty good. A lot of people are trying hard to keep their surveys short. But even so, it does bother me to see that 20% of surveys take 15 minutes or longer. You know how often you wait desperately for the commercial to come on TV so you can get a drink, a sweater, check your email, or do some other task. We have a hard enough time paying attention for 7 minutes, let alone 15 minutes in our spare time. So one of the things we can do easily is shorten our surveys. We can put more surveys into the 5 to 15 minute bucket instead of the 15 to 30 minute bucket. And that was the whole premise of this research study. I took a beautiful 20-minute survey and cut it in half to two 12-minute surveys. I even cut the incentive in half. So instead of paying 600 people the full incentive, I paid 300 people half the incentive and another 300 people the other half of the incentive. Now, it doesn't seem like we've gained very much here, but really we have. Financially, we've saved half the incentives, although personally I'd be inclined to spend that money on doubling the sample sizes. And the other thing, by shortening the surveys, we've made it easier for responders to pay attention. We've bored them for less time about a topic that really is only interesting to you and the brand manager. So as you see here, this study had 3 groups. One group answered the 20-minute survey. One group answered the first half of that survey for about 12 minutes. And then the third group answered the last half of the survey for about 12 minutes. Now, of course, there is one major problem with this study. And there are major problems with every study, so that's no big deal, no surprise. One of the problems is that people knew going into the survey that it was going to be 12 minutes or that it was going to be 20 minutes, whichever one they were offered. So from the very beginning, people self-selected into the study depending on whether they wanted to answer a short survey or whether they wanted to answer a long survey. And the second big problem is that we're going to try to compare what is essentially three completely different surveys. Even though all three surveys had small pieces that overlapped, each survey in its entirety was very different. So some people might be getting fatigued at 10 minutes and finishing up, while other people can be getting fatigued at 15 minutes and still have more to do. And since the first half of the survey was about hotels and the second half of the survey was about air travel, we're also looking at completely different leading or priming questions. So this kind of study is nothing like comparing men versus women or basic question wording A versus question wording B. We're really looking at three completely different surveys. So in terms of comparisons, we've got three things to focus on here. First of all, data quality. If the data quality of the short or the long survey is particularly worse, then there's no point in proceeding. Then we also looked at data equivalence. Do the three surveys give us the same results? Do we come to the same conclusions regardless of which version we use? And lastly, we looked at responder satisfaction. Do people like one of the surveys more than the other? Are they so unhappy with the short version or the long version that it simply isn't an option? All right, so let's start with data quality. Where possible, we use questions that appeared on all three versions of the survey, but you will see a few cases where only two surveys had the question. And it's good to have overlapping questions in a split survey for just this reason. Alrighty, I always love a good red herring question. They're really hard to write because even the made-up brand names often sound like real brand names. So you have to do some serious internet searching to find a realistic sounding brand that sounds nothing like real brands. So here we've got 6 different red herrings. 4 of them appeared in all 3 surveys, and 2 of them only appeared in 2 of the surveys. So let's just look at the very first red herring. You see that in the long survey, about 4% of people failed this measure. In short survey A, about 3% of people failed it. And in short survey B, about 3% of people failed it. So overall, the long survey did not fare as well as the short survey. And that same type of result was seen with the second, third, and fifth red herring questions. The longer survey failed in comparison to the shorter surveys. On the other hand, red herring number 4 and number 6 didn't really favor either the long or the short survey. So overall, I'd have to say that the short surveys gave at least as good and possibly better data quality when it comes to red herrings. Now let's look at straightlining. This survey had many opportunities for people to straight line. 4 of those opportunities were available to everyone, and 2 were also available for short survey A, and 3 were available for short survey B. So we've got 4 cases here where the short surveys did at least as good or a better job than the long survey. Then we've got 4 cases where the results were mixed. One survey did better than the long survey, and the other survey did worse. So again, the short surveys did at least as good and possibly better than the long survey in terms of straightlining. Another thing that's really important is whether responders are following instructions. In this case, I gave people the opportunity to provide multiple responses to a couple of the questions, even though the questions specifically said to choose only one answer. Now that does make it a bit tricky because some people might have felt like they were getting a double message. But we tried it out just the same. So in both cases, a higher percentage of people answering the long survey failed this test. And people answering the short survey were more likely to provide only one answer as they were asked to do. So again, short wins over long. Not by a lot, that's for sure, but it certainly is winning. Of course, we all know just how important the open ends are. That's where we find the little tidbits of knowledge that we forgot to ask about elsewhere, and that's where people get their turn to decide what to talk about instead of just obeying us the entire time. This survey had 6 places that asked the responder to type in a full answer. And we used a very simple measure here, certainly not as complicated as it could have been. This measure checked for nonsense answers like ASDF, or answers that didn't have any vowels, as well as answers that were less than 10 characters. It's pretty hard to say something meaningful with less than 10 characters. So what you see in this chart are the fail rates across each of the 6 verbatim questions. In 5 cases, the shorter survey gave answers that were the same as or better than the longer survey. The differences are slight, they're not statistically significant, but what we're looking for is a collection of conclusions across the entire survey, not just one behavior on one single question. The last data quality measure I'll mention here is speeding because it is such an important measure. Now, obviously I can't compare rates of speeding for surveys that are of different lengths. The fastest 5% of people will always be on the short survey, so there's just nowhere to put a cut point. But what I can do is standardize the survey durations within each survey and see if there are any skews that differentiate the long and the short versions. Maybe the curve for one of the surveys is steeper or flatter, but as you see here, given the red line of the long survey, it's sitting nicely between the green and blue lines, which are the short surveys. It's right in the middle for pretty much the whole time. It's impossible to say that the distribution of survey durations was any way meaningfully different among the long or short surveys. So let's just leave this one by saying there are no indicators to make us think that the long or short surveys had more speeders. It's kind of hard to tell at this point. All right, so across the measures I just shared with you, we can draw a very basic conclusion about data quality. The quality of the short surveys was at least as good and possibly better than the long survey. There's no evidence to suggest that we get massively better or massively worse data by using a short or long survey. We do have to keep in mind that people self-selected into the long or short survey, so everyone was in a frame of mind to do a reasonable job on the survey they ended up with. I know we'd all like to see much better data quality in the short survey, but we don't always get exactly what we want. So before the next analyses, we dropped the worst portions of the data set. We aimed for about 5% overall, and given the cut points that were possible, these are the percentages that we ended up with for each survey. Pretty close. All right, now let's take a look at data equivalence. If we know that data quality isn't going to stop us from splitting horribly long surveys into 2, let's try something else. If the results and the conclusions of the long and short surveys are different, then that would be why we don't waste our time trying to split long surveys into short surveys. So first we looked at the results of a question taken from the middle of the long survey. How many trips did you take in the last year? Now remember, the middle of the long survey is actually the beginning of one short survey and the end of the other short survey. So what this means is the three surveys have completely different leading introductory questions. It's highly possible that we could see different answers on the three surveys because the introductory questions led them to think about different things. But you can see that not only was the data essentially the same, the conclusion that we would draw from this data is the same. The vast majority of people took 1 to 3 trips last year, while about half as many took 4 or more trips last year. So the information gathered by brand managers would have resulted in the same conclusion. Here's another example from the middle of the survey. You can see that some of the raw numbers are a bit different to the point where they are statistically different. However, take note of the rank orders. The rank orders of awareness of the different airlines was not different. The airline that has the highest awareness for one of the surveys had the highest awareness for the other surveys. And similarly, the airline with the lowest awareness always had the lowest awareness. So then across all of the airlines, the rank ordering was essentially the same. A couple of them swapped 4th and 5th place, but there were no cases where a 2nd place was swapped with a 10th place. So basically, the conclusions that a brand manager would have drawn from the 3 sets of data were the same. Delta is the highest, several airlines are very close behind, and Northern Airlines is all by itself very far behind. This is a question that was placed at the end of the long survey. So one short survey prefaced this with a bunch of questions about airlines. The other short survey prefaced it with a bunch of questions about hotels. And of course, the long survey prefaced it with questions about airlines and hotels. So once again, though the raw numbers are a little bit different, the overall conclusion is still the same. People like billboards the most. People like flyers the least. Whether you ask a short survey or a long survey, the conclusion that you would draw after evaluating this data is essentially the same. Here's another question from the end of a long survey. In this case, both the raw data and the rank order data is essentially the same for both surveys. The conclusions we draw from the data are the same. The raw number is the same, the trend is the same, the conclusion is essentially the same. Right, so this is the last data equivalence question I'll show here. Once again, when we ask people about some of their personality characteristics, we saw the same descriptions in all 3 surveys. It didn't matter if we bored them with a 12-minute survey about airlines or a 12-minute survey about hotels or a 20-minute survey about hotels and airlines. The fact that people were experiencing different levels of fatigue and answering the questions, having previously answered completely different questions, didn't really matter. The conclusions from the 3 studies, the 3 surveys, were essentially the same. So that leaves us with our final question. We've seen that the data quality of short surveys was at least as good and possibly better than a long survey. And we also saw that the short surveys led to very similar conclusions as the long surveys. So all that's left now is to determine whether responders had a more enjoyable time answering the long or the short surveys. Because really, in the end, our responders are the most important piece of the puzzle here. We just can't leave them out of the picture because it's not convenient. So one way to think about responder engagement is in terms of how willingly they participate in open-end questions. Do they take shortcuts, or do they take the time to provide a good response? So here we see the average number of characters typed in response to the 6 verbatim questions. In 4 of the cases, the shorter survey led to longer responses. And then the other couple of cases, it was barely less for the shorter surveys. So it's leaning in favor of the shorter survey, though it's not a huge win. We can also look at responses to a short responder satisfaction survey that was offered at the end of each survey. So responders agreed that the longer survey was too long, and they were more likely to recommend the shorter survey to other people. On the other hand, however, they were split on whether the long or short survey was easier or more boring. Now, the last thing we looked at in terms of responder satisfaction was the very last open-ended question. This is a voluntary question, so people don't have to fill it in to finish the survey and qualify for the incentive. They can easily skip it. So we looked at the percentage of responses in this box that were positive. And as you see here, both of the short surveys generated more positive comments than the long survey did. All right, so I am sure you'll agree we did not get a slam dunk win here. What we did see is that data quality of the short surveys was as good or better than the long survey. And we also saw that the conclusions generated from the short survey were essentially the same as the conclusions from the long survey. And we saw that survey satisfaction was just as good or better than the long survey. So together, looking at all of the little bits of data, all of the little measures all the way throughout, this really does lead me to one single conclusion. If there is any way we can split a long survey into 2 shorter surveys, we really need to do it. It's just not an option. Now, do keep in mind this was not a perfect test. People readied themselves to answer the short or the long survey. And it would have been far better if we could tell everyone they were taking a 20-minute survey and then cut some of the people off at 12 minutes, but that's not really something I'm keen to do. Another thing to keep in mind is sampling error and margin of error. Now, this research was done with a non-probability incentivized sample. It's certainly not a pure probability sample at all. And that means that margin of error just isn't appropriate. However, the theory of margin of error is very much appropriate. Essentially, if you give the same people the same survey 2 days in a row, you will get different answers. That's essentially the theory, and it applies perfectly to what we've done here. Yes, some of the results were different. That's just part of the research process. We will always generate different results, different numbers from day to day. What we need to look for are numbers that change our thinking, that make us draw different conclusions. And that's just not what we saw here. And lastly, I'd like to remind folks that as much as we really want and really like it when everyone answers every single question in a survey, they really don't need to. That's just our own selfishness, really, our own unwillingness to work with missing data. And we do need to stop focusing solely on the needs of the researcher and start thinking about the people we are subjecting our work to. So where we can make surveys shorter, we really should do it. Unless every single question in your survey is going to be thrown into a factor analysis, it's time to rethink whether every single person needs to answer every single question. And that brings me to the end of my presentation. So if you have any questions, do feel free to type them in the box, the question box on the side of your screen. and I will try to get to as many of them as I can. If I don't happen to get to your question, you can always tweet me, email me, link in with me, however you want to social meet me, question me. I'm more than happy to do that. So just let me take a quick second here and go through the questions that we've got. All right, so someone is asking, why is there so much variability across the two short survey versions? I'd expect them to be more consistent. What is going on? Yes, there is variability, and part of that is simply random chance. As I mentioned, from day to day, the same person is indeed going to answer the same question in a different way. So we have to expect that every single number we see has a theoretical margin of error around it. And then on top of that, we're looking at two short surveys that were essentially completely different. One was all about hotels, one was all about airlines. So people are in a very different frame of mind as they go through each of the surveys. So yes, there are a couple questions at the beginning, the middle, and the end that are same, but everything between them was completely different. All right, let's see another question. Oh, shucks, I wish I had brought that answer. Someone's asking the response rate for the long versus short. Unfortunately, off the top of my head, I don't remember exact numbers. I do remember they weren't terribly far from each other. It wasn't like one was 10% and one was 20%, something like that. It was a reasonable difference. Let's see. Did you look at any of these by age, gender buckets to look for demo differences? Oh, that would be really fun to do. I have not done that. I always do love to look at age, gender differences. At the same time, I always worry when you start slicing and dicing 300, you get into such small groups that the numbers really fluctuate and you can't see a whole lot. But that is absolutely a fun thing to do, and we all know data quality differs by particularly age and gender, and particularly when you're looking at the young males. What else have we got here? Someone is asking, are some surveys better suited to being split like this? Absolutely. There are some surveys like this one that had very clear chunks or sections. So in my case, one chunk was hotels, one chunk was airlines. It was very easy to find a split point in that survey. And I'm sure there are a lot of other surveys that have at least reasonably clear sections to them. So I think those would be better cases to try out shortening surveys by splitting them in two. Another comment there is I would recommend avoiding surveys that have sensitive sections, religion, politics, alcohol, all those sorts of things, because those really do put us in a very specific frame of mind. They get our guard up, make us a little cautious, and that's one place where answers can really change just because our frame of mind is so different. So if you do happen to have a survey with clear chunks about fairly neutral topics, then I think you're in a good position to consider splitting a long survey into two shorter pieces. We have come to the end of our half hour. Thank you very much for joining me. If you enjoyed this webinar, there are a few others on the Peanut Labs website, so do have a peek. And I will see you next month at our next webinar. Here's wishing you lovely response rates and lots of responder engagement. Cheers, everyone.